welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. I'm C.R. Wiley. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, actually right outside Portland, Oregon. People just can't believe it, but that's where I am. I'm about a half an hour from the airport. And anyway, it's a beautiful day here, and I've written a number of things, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, and that actually is relevant today concerning the guest and some things he's done. Anyway, why don't we kick it over to you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, and a few other things. One of the places, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Do a little preaching, a little ministry, a little speaking, a little writing, and other things.
Right. All right, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a recovering history professor specializing in Reformation Europe. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work with Reflections Ministries. I do freelance teaching, and I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries, esquareinch.org.
Great. Well, we have a special guest today. We're really pleased to welcome Father Mark Perkins, and he's going to share with us a little bit about a school that he oversees, as well as some things he writes about. So, Mark, please introduce yourself.
Sure. I am the chaplain and assistant headmaster of St. Dunstan's Academy, which is here in Nelson County, Virginia, kind of in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I'm also a priest in the Anglican province of America, a former high school teacher, and spent some time in full-time ministry in Florida as well.
Great. Well, tell us about the school a little bit. From what you've described in our email correspondence, it sounds great.
Yeah. So St. Dunstan's Academy is a farm, trades, and classics boarding school for high school boys. We're on a 176-acre farm. Like I said, we're right in the Blue Ridge Mountains. If behind me, you can't see it, but there's the Three Ridges Mountain here and the Priest Mountain over there. And you can see our campus, some of the fields on our campus anyway, from the Appalachian Trail. So we're right next to the mountains. As you're saying earlier, timber framing is a sort of central part of the vision of our school together, how we want to build our school and how we want to manage our forests as well. We also have a gap year program we're launching this fall called the Joshua Program, Vocational Discernment for High School Graduates, helping recent high school graduates grow closer to Christ, grow in competence, and grow up is kind of the vision we have for that.
Right. Well, and the product of some of the students is right there all around you. You've got a timber frame structure that you're in right now. And that's great. I'm a big fan of timber framing. Haven't had the opportunity to do any of it myself, but I've always dreamed about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, and you're bringing together some things there that aren't often put together. For one thing, it's a boys' school. So that's something that's worth reflecting on a little bit. But then it's also classical in terms of its education and content. And then you've got the vocational element. So all of those things at the same time, pretty, I guess, countercultural or maybe recovery of culture. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Right. Yeah. One of the things we talk about, I do think our vision and our program, our project is unique, but it shares a lot in common with older ways of school. So Thomas, our headmaster, will always say that we're not an elite finishing school, like what a lot of the Episcopal boarding schools have become. We're not a reform school like the military academies around the corner from us here. We're a good life school. And that kind of middle way used to be more common. The kind of vocational trades used to be a little closer to a lot of schools' ethos, a lot of what they did. So that's disappeared in the last 50 or 60 years. And so in a lot of ways, we are indeed recovering something that was once more common than it is.
Yeah, I think about like Roxbury Latin in Boston, which is a classic boys boarding school. I'm not sure if it's a boarding school or maybe it's a mix, but it's, if I remember correctly, the oldest school in the United States. It's older than Harvard. Wow. And my son Caleb, who you saw a minute ago, when he was little, when we lived in Boston, we considered sending him there, and we went over to visit, and they were still flying the Union Jack. That was a lot of fun. You drive up, and then you see the Union Jack. In case you're wondering what the Union Jack is, it's the flag of the United Kingdom. but and then they call their teachers their master still. At least they did back in the early 90s. I don't know if it's still the case. But the other thing was it was still an all-boys school and a pretty rigorous education, but definitely more on the prep side of things, not the hands-on stuff that you do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, my dad went to an Episcopal boys' school in Tennessee that had a, as he describes it, a kind of broad diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds. And we went and visited. I think I was 12. We went back for one of his high school anniversaries, and we're driving around, and he just kept saying, "This is not the school I went to." It was from co-ed, and even apart from, if you actually went into the classrooms and started talking to people, you would have found progressive ideology all over the place. But even apart from that, it was this, every lawn was manicured, every building looked immaculate. And that's what's happened to a lot of if you're not at a military school, if you're not at a reform school, then you're at a resort where your parents pay, an enormous amount for you not to have to do anything during high school. And it turns out that's actually really bad for anyone, and maybe particularly bad in certain ways for boys.
Let's think about education for boys a little bit, because there's a lot of commiserating right now about the performance of boys in school and stuff. And there have been people in the past who noted that boys tend to do better in single, sex education environments. What was the thinking for you and the folks there at the academy when it came to that? Was that what you were thinking?
Yeah. So the part of the origin story, I'm the chaplain and assistant headmaster. I'm sort of the co-founder, the second guy. Thomas Fickley is our founder and headmaster, and he was finishing, this is some years back, he was finishing his master's degree in American history, and he wrote his thesis on the history of American educational philosophy. And as he was finishing his last semester there, he found out that his wife was pregnant with twin boys, 4 and 5. And so he briefly had 5 boys under the age of 6. You can imagine. Anyone who knows Thomas knows that Thomas has more energy than just about anyone I've ever met. And as Thomas's brother-in-law, his wife's brother, put it last week, how did you pass that on to every one of your boys? It's a very boisterous household.
Well, I can imagine that would provide a real incentive for starting a boarding school.
Yeah. He should have started one and then left it. So but no, they're gonna be around him still. But yeah, as he was looking at his boys, he thought, okay, maybe God is telling me I'm supposed to be thinking particularly about the education of boys. And then paired with that, he taught for a number of years at a boarding school in the area here. And then we taught together. We went to church together for about 8 or 9 years. We only overlapped teaching together for 1 year at a day school here in town. It was a really good day school. It still is. Great faculty, great families, great curriculum, great leadership. And nevertheless, we were finding that our students were suffering from a lot of the same anxiety, a lot of the same acedia, and a lot of the same kind of failure to launch for the boys in particular that he had been seeing at his secular boarding school, and that you were sort of seeing out there. So one of the ways I put it is after the 47th time you've said, what's wrong with these boys as a teacher? And you're saying it about the 7th different year and the 23rd different section, then you start to say, I wonder if it's actually the boys. I wonder if the problem is that every single boy here has some problem, or is it that we as a community and we as a culture have forgotten how to educate boys? So I think there was a question behind that for Thomas. I had my 2 eldest are girls. I have 2 girls and 2 boys now. Thomas now has his 7th boy was born 2 weeks ago. And then and then he's got one girl in there.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the same kind of personal incentive at that time to think about it. But Thomas was really driven by seeing the outcomes for boys and thinking about, is this what I want my sons to go into? So that was kind of the push, and then the willingness to step back and to think, what would a school for boys look like if I didn't take anything for granted, if I didn't assume, well, we've got to do it this way because that's the way everybody does it. If you were building it from the ground up, what would that look like? And it wasn't just his imagination. He was doing a lot of reading at that time. Somebody put a book about the Roman Catholic educational reformer John Senior, who's been very influential, mostly in Catholic circles, but not only, into his hands early in that process. And that was an important sort of spark for the imagination as well.
Yeah, well, that's great. Any questions for you, Tom or Glenn?
Well, I just kind of a few things came to mind when you were talking about his, the kind of lead up to it. Is I did my undergrad in philosophy of education similarly, and I remember just a complete lack of anything interested in recovering or retrieving something for predominantly boy education. There was no discussion of it. Nothing we read in the curriculum at all paid attention to it, and it was working exactly the other way. It was basically about how we can progressively change so that basically males, in some sense, fail. Don't any longer have any kind of ways at which they could have, in any sense of the word, an advantage. And the things that they took interest in were particularly being intentionally left out. So it wasn't just that they were kind of being equalized playing field. It was deliberate to leave them out. And I know I have two boys, and I know how quickly education, when it doesn't attend to those things that pertain to them being boys, how quickly they lose interest and go on to other things.
That's right.
Right. So, Mark, what are some things that you would say are the benefits that can be enjoyed when you just have an education that's focused on boys and it's kind of ground up, and you're just thinking about their needs? What are the things that you think need to happen or have happened that you've observed?
Yeah. And I should say, by the way, that we are in the building phase, the pre-launch phase of our school. So we've had lots of high school boys out helping us build this building that we're in, the building that we're building over there. But we're planning to welcome, I should say, our first cohort this fall. So we're in kind of the pre-launch phase. I think there's a number of things that flow from thinking about the particular needs of boys. And I would say there are two things. And one, of course, it's always hard to talk about a lot of the things. Our sort of contemporary school system is not serving anybody well. So I wouldn't say that girls are flourishing in school today either.
That's right.
But they have, and there's overlap in the problem. So it's not nothing. Well, some of the things I say are mutually exclusive, but not everything is. But there are some things that I think are kind of distinctive about boys, which is that I'm not sure that any adolescent, boy or girl, is meant to sit in a desk for 30 to 40 hours a week. But it sure is not the case for boys. It is just crushing to most boys. And so many of the behavioral problems that we see, and it's not just in high school, but you see it pop up in a different way in high school, is just that you are asking young, adolescent boys, young adolescent bodies to do something that they're really not intended to be doing, which is sitting around and by intended, I mean, I don't think that's how God created adolescents to be. And so these young men really ought to be using their bodies in meaningful, useful ways. There's a great psychologist in the area named Joe Davis, wonderful friend of the project. And he says that modern society asks adolescents to do something that nobody is capable of doing, which is to define your own individual identity on your own by yourself by turning inward. So we ask young people to do something that we can't do, that nobody can do, that was never intended for us to do. And then the things, he said this just as an aside at a talk, he said, and the things that we can do, like operating a power saw, we say, oh, no, you can't do that. That's dangerous. Don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think attending to boys as embodied beings, you start with that and you say, okay, so we need to spend, of course you have to be in a desk sometimes, or at least you have to be taking notes and working formally in school, but you don't have to do it in a desk. And as soon as you say, you don't have to do that inside. And as soon as you say that to any veteran teacher, and like I said, I taught for 9 years in a fairly traditional, classically inclined, but fairly traditional day school. And the first time Thomas said, we're going to do most of our teaching outside, I said, that's insane. Have you ever tried to take a class outside? It's wild. You can't, there's all sorts of distractions everywhere, and you're trying to get their attention, and they're just, and number one, that's true.
I've had that problem with college classes that I've taken outside.
we have that problem with adults that we bring out to the work site sometimes. So it is true that a sort of climate controlled classroom with I can't credit this correctly because I can't remember who wrote it, with walls the color of institutional failure was the line that if you make everything else incredibly boring, maybe and not worth looking at, then maybe you'll get their attention on your subject, which is I think that's perhaps unintentionally the way that many schools are designed, but I'm not always sure it's unintentional. So yes, it's true. You have to fight for their attention. But I think there's two things to say. One is I'm a lot happier to fight for a student's attention when the things that are rivals are good things. When the things that are rivals are not their phone that they have in their pocket that they're thinking about if it's not in their lap and they're looking at it. It's not maybe, and not that this is a bad thing, but it's not. My wife says, and she's entirely correct, that although I took 4 semesters of Spanish, I didn't learn anything because I was trying to flirt with her the entire time.
So that's a really important point. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I was turned around the entire time. One of the lines I ran into with single-sex education is that boys do better in single-sex education because they aren't distracting girls, and girls do better because they aren't being distracted by boys. There's a certain truth there. But outdoors, you're being. What are you being distracted by? You're being distracted by the beauty of God's creation, and so that's a more acceptable distraction. But the other thing is that the reason that my classes went crazy when I brought them outside is because they were never outside. They never had a chance to acclimate to being outside, and so you bring them outside, and you thought, "Oh, this was a disaster. I'll never do it again." Well, what if you did it again and again and again, and then you figured out a way to operate your class outdoors, recognizing that you are going to be interrupted by neat things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If a deer walks by while you're teaching, you probably should stop. Whatever you're teaching is probably not more important than sort of this beautiful creature sort of walking by, or maybe sometimes this tick-ridden creature I sometimes think of. We have lots of ticks.
I know that.
So I think that's a big part of it is attending to their embodiment. The other thing, and I know I'm rambling a little bit here, the other thing is that the typical conventional model of instruction in classrooms tends to, in the sciences and maths in particular, you tend to start with abstract theory, and then you learn and you learn and you learn. And at the end, your teacher says, and they might say this at the beginning, but it's all sort of abstract. You say, now what could you do with this? Thomas talks about this in trigonometry. You learn trigonometry, for weeks, you drill it, and then at the end, your teacher says, well, what can we do with this now? And by that time, you're just so bored with it, you're ready to move on. It is much more powerful to invert that and to begin with a tangible problem, to begin with something that you want to address, and then to turn to math as a solution. So the classic example here is when there's a timber frame over here that we raised about a month ago. The initial raising was a month ago, and we had about 50 people out, and we put a lot of people on a rope. And that rope was going through a homemade A-frame crane with pulleys, block and tackle and everything. And it was attached to a 4,000-pound wall that we had to lift up into the air and then set down. And the only way to do that safely is to be able to calculate all the tolerances of the rope, and then the tensions and forces on the rope based on the pulley system that you have. And the only way to get that answer is to use trigonometry. So Thomas always says that he took a traditional raisings and riggings course up in New Hampshire at a timber frame school up there, and they were getting ready to do this very thing, and he's furiously trying to run the numbers to check, and he suddenly realized he'd never ever been as invested in getting a math problem correct as he had been.
Right.
Get it wrong, the rope snaps, the thing falls, and you lose weeks of work, not to mention potentially thousands of dollars if it's broken. So,
Sure.
Inverting, starting with a problem and then saying, all right, how are we going to figure this out? We're going to have to know some trigonometry. Let's go back to paper here and figure it out, and then we'll come tackle that problem.
Yeah, that's great. So when it comes to working with your hands, there are many people in education who don't spend much time working with their hands. Bringing these two things together is another thing that's intriguing about the school. When it comes to that, say, for example, parents and how they're assessing whether or not they want, their sons to come to your school. How are you presenting this? Because a lot of parents, particularly parents maybe who are white collar in backgrounds, and they think about a vocation almost and they think about maybe college as being absolutely essential, and what would this have to do with that, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We tend to assume that most of our students will end up going to college based on the kind of demographics that we're expecting from our student body. And we're not discouraging that. What I do want to discourage or destroy or undermine is the false dichotomy, the false choice that says that if you can choose between college and poverty, and that if you want to make any money in this world, then you have to go to college. I think there's all sorts of good reasons to go to college. If the only thing that I need to earn a living, and therefore somebody has told me that I have to go to college to do that, that's a bad reason to go to college, because it's not true. It's never been true. And we could dive into the statistics that say otherwise. People will say, "Oh, no, you can still see there's economic benefit from getting a bachelor degree. People who get 4-year degrees have higher income than those who don't." But that is entirely, I think, anyway. And Warren Cass, who wrote The Once and Future Worker, he makes this argument much more eloquently than I can. That's entirely a matter of sample bias. If you tell an entire population that if you want to get anywhere in life, you have to go to college, then you automatically select out the most motivated people. And so essentially, if you say all the most motivated people in a society are going to go to college and the less motivated people aren't, then of course that outcome is going to be the case, but it has nothing to do, or at least it's only indirectly related to the college degree itself. So, and I would say that the sort of alternative version of that, or the reason that's not true among others, is that there has never been, I don't think, a more economically lucrative time to be a tradesman or a craftsman.
That's true.
But the average age of plumbers is up in the 60s, if I recall. The average age of electricians is in the upper 50s. I was reading a study that said that 50% of electrical jobs are currently unfilled.
Wow.
The number of electrical jobs is forecasted, and maybe the AI apocalypse will change all this. Who knows? But I think one of you is writing a book on that, I think. But right now, the forecast is that the number of electrical jobs is going to quadruple in the next, 10 or 20 years. And you're going to have all those late 50s, median age retirements happening. Yeah. So we're going to have, unless the AI apocalypse comes first, we're going to have an electrician apocalypse. Yeah. And what does that mean? That means that electrician jobs are going to become more and more lucrative. I've had 2 or 3 different encounters during the life of this project where one was a lawyer and one was a doctor, telling me almost the exact same story, which is that I had my plumbing went wild in the middle of the night, so I had to call a plumber for an emergency visit. He came and did it, and then I looked at my bill and realized that his sort of billable hours was something like double the lawyer's billable hours.
The doctors at the hours they need them.
That's right. So anyway, that's a little bit rambly, all to say that what we do want to do is actually put in front of our high school boys a vision of a good life that doesn't necessarily require college. But we want them, it's not that we don't want them to go to college, we want them to go to college for good reasons. which I would consider, which, a good college is a place where you become a more fully flourishing human being if you approach it correctly. So that would be a good reason. I think also you might want to become an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, and those are all good vocations done, pursued correctly. And then you do have to go to college. So we're not discouraging college, but we want to point out that it is not necessary for a good living to support a family, and it's not necessary for a good life either. But I'd say more broadly, and then I'll stop rambling here, is that the vision, we're not a trade school. We're not a vocational trade school. We're a school that teaches trades, but we teach trades because it's pedagogically valuable, because we live in a society that is entirely dislocated from embodiment, entirely divorced from creation. And so we want to re-embody our boys, to reorient them to creation. And we think the trades are actually a particularly useful way to do that.
Yeah, great. You got something you want to say, Tom? It looked like you did.
I was just thinking, there have been other generations in which the well-rounded educated could go out and plow a field, build a house, and also read the Greek New Testament and be doing oftentimes all of those things within a day. And so even the notion that scholarship and trades have to be compartmentalized in a family or in a life is just, it isn't the case. It's just that I think, again, one of the things we don't do well is imagine what it's like to expand our sense of time in a day. We tend to rush things and think we have to master things quickly. And I think part of working with your hands, it's similar with playing an instrument. It takes time. And it teaches you to sometimes stretch out what you can do in a day in a different way and value from it. So I just think, it's an incredible insight into what you're doing there. Very good.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would like to entertain is the prospect of kind of bringing back that yeomanry, well-educated yeomanry that you're referring to, Tom. You think about, say, even, the old New England Brahman, who maybe was raised on a dairy farm like George Gilder, but was also a Harvard guy and a Marine. I mean, you don't see those three things come together at all anymore. I can't think of, maybe J.D. Vance, but he didn't grow up with a silver spoon. He did go to Yale, but his story is remarkable because he's coming out of the underclass. But you don't see the upper classes so much living that way. Now, I'd imagine that many of the people who have an interest in the program because of your denomination and because of where you're located are probably a little better off. Am I right in assuming that, Mark?
Yes, I think so. Although, yes, I think that certainly is the case. But it is also the case that a lot of our most interested families are homeschooling families that are really interested and are wondering whether they're going to be able to swing, it financially.
Gotcha. So is there kind of a major fundraising component then, not just for like facilities, but also for tuition and stuff?
Yes. So although my title is chaplain and assistant headmaster in the pre-launch phase, I am primarily responsible for the sort of fundraising side of things. Thomas Fickley, our founder headmaster, is also a licensed commercial builder. We're the only high school in the Commonwealth of Virginia that owns a building license as an institution. So the building over there, we're cool. Subcontracting out our excavation and our electrical, but everything else we're doing with our own labor primarily. So Thomas is busy with the build. I'm tasked with a lot of the fundraising.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the advantages, of course, of being a school that's 350 to 400 years old, like Roxbury Latin, is they had an enormous endowment, and they could just take anybody who they felt like could do the work. Now you're kind of, well, it's like you're 400 years in the past, 400 years behind, whatever. But yeah, we'll be praying for you and hope that you can pull that off.
Glenn, I think.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me here, I mean, I really like what you're telling me about the curriculum. But one of the things that I'm struck by is the idea of a boarding school rather than a day school. And this is something that I suppose people in wealthier classes maybe are more, familiar with or more used to. But I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about it. And on one level, I was thinking, I'm not sure I would be really happy sending my kids off to a boarding school when they were in high school. But then the other part of me said, wait a minute, you're a historian. Think about this. When you go back into the past, what you see is that there is a habit in all classes of fostering. If you're going to go into the trade, what do? You send your kid off to be an apprentice, and he lives with the master, starts off doing grunt work, and then eventually learns more skills and so on until he becomes a journeyman. If you're a noble, you send your son off to be a page in the Middle Ages. If you are a peasant woman, what do? You send your daughter off to work as a maid in a wealthy household, and you learn skills that way. I mean, this idea of a boarding school is just simply an extension in a lot of ways of all of these kinds of fostering experiences that people had, in a lot of ways before there were that many organized schools per se. But this is how you learned your skills. This is how you learned your job. It was through a kind of boarding education.
Are you finding resistance on that, Mark, at all?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the very first time I presented on this at the church where I was serving, after it was announced that I was going to be going and doing this project, I took a Sunday school class to sort of explain what I was doing. And later that week, an older gentleman, wonderful guy, came up to me and he said, so what kind of students are you looking for? Are they the kind of students who can't hack it in normal school? Or are they the ones whose parents are so rich they can't be bothered with them? And I said, neither, please, Lord, neither. That's not our demographic. So we always say for parents, there's a set of parents who know that their current situation is not working. And so there is a kind of, I say, like, there's a kind of kid. I think about my brother and my brother-in-law who both hit ninth grade, and I sort of envision them picking their heads up off the desk and thinking, why am I here? What am I doing anymore? And they just checked out, and they were so bored and so done with school. And they weren't fundamentally rebellious kids, but they got that reputation because they were bored. And so what do bored teenagers do? They act out. Yeah. So we're not like, it's not, jail or St. Dunstan's Academy. That's not our model. But there are a lot of boys who are just they're not flourishing where they are, and they may flourish with us. But one of the things we say is that if parents aren't really it's not a real sacrifice for them to send their sons away, they're probably not the right families for us. So that is absolutely, I would say, the more than the trades. I found that even we're kind of coming out of Charlottesville, Virginia, with University of Virginia there, and it's a very educated, tends to be pretty white class, fairly wealthy community, and maybe even especially among that group of folks. And part of it's that Matthew Crawford, who wrote Shop Class's Soulcraft, is a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA, and so some of it's maybe a little bit local, but we found that there's not a lot of pushback on the trades and on vocational work. There's a sort of recognition that that's a need. The boarding school is different. I think one of the ways that I talk about it is I say that, everyone knows that at some point their son has to leave the home. We all know that the 35-year-old playing video games in his parents' basement, something has gone awry. So the question is not, do I send my son out into the world? It's how and when. And we have a kind of, especially among kind of white middle-class folks, we have a kind of assumed common sense, a cultural common sense that says that 18 years old is the right time and sending them off to college is the right way. And I just don't think that that's necessarily the case. Just as Glenn was saying, you look historically and you find that that's really not the norm for anyone prior to our own time. And the other side of things that I talk about a lot is this sort of universality of rites of passage in most cultures. somewhere
Right.
between 12 and 15 years old. Boys would be temporarily removed from the family. They'd be initiated into manhood through challenge, and then they'd be assimilated into their adulthood. That took a lot of different forms. American culture never really had the kind of universal, systematic version of it that you'll find in a lot of tribal cultures. But just as Glenn was saying, the fostering system, the apprenticeship system, that all filled that. The way I usually illustrate that is with the story of the boy Jesus in the temple as a kind of rite of passage, which I borrow from a guy named Jason Craig, who's got a great book called Leaving Boyhood Behind. But I did a presentation on 4th of July weekend at a church in Hillsdale, Michigan, and the theme, it was a 4th of July weekend kind of thing. So I became growing up like Jesus and the founding fathers. And what I did is I went through American founders and just looked at, all right, when did they go away from home?
Right.
And what did their sort of transition into adulthood look like? And for most of them, somewhere between 12 and 15, or 16, I suppose, they left home either to board with a tutor. That often happened. John Adams did that. Thomas Jefferson did that. Or they left to go off to college. Famously, Alexander Hamilton, who has his own amazing background, he said he probably lied about his age because he was too old for college at 17. So he said he was 16. And if I'm remembering the story now, Princeton, the College of New Jersey, said, no, you're still too old. And they rejected him. So he ended up at King's College, which is now Columbia, because they would accept him at the ripe old age of 16 for starting.
That reminds me of the stories that you hear about men in the past who, by the time they were 20 years old, had written 3 books and could translate 5 languages.
Yeah.
When I was an undergrad, I remember running into an account of a 14-year-old boy who had been in a position on a ship. Forgot exactly what they would have called it. But when the captain died on a voyage, he was the senior officer on the ship. So he took over he led the ship, took it to, I think it was Barbados, did all of the, the trading and things like that. On the way back, he evaded pirates and got back into Boston. And there was an account of this in the newspaper. And the thing that was most remarkable about it was they didn't think this was a big deal. Right? He just simply did what he was expected to do. And, so it's just a very simple narrative account, not, wow, look at this kid. It's, so this is what happened on the ship.
It was probably great for his self-esteem too. This is the fun thing about it. When you think about the goofy approach that we have to that matter today, self-esteem, it's all about basically talking up kids and complimenting them for basically nothing. And the idea is that if they believe in themselves, they'll accomplish great things. And what you have in a situation like this is kid does great things and he believes in himself.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we talk about for rites of passage the way we believe anyway the best way to usher a young boy into his adulthood and to make him into a young man is to remove him from the home temporarily, to put him around a bunch of adult mentors and peers. And then to teach him some sort of embodied competence that has a little bit of risk, at least. It has to at least feel dangerous, but is also useful. So, cliff diving or cliff jumping can be kind of a rite of passage of sorts because it's scary and you show a kind of courage in doing it, but it doesn't really help anybody. So the version that we do here out at campus in our pre-launch phase is we've been having these high school boys from local churches come out. And after they're sort of carefully taught, they bring down a giant red oak tree with a chainsaw.
Nice.
Both my coworkers are chainsaw whizzes and excellent instructors. And it's not actually, it is dangerous. As Morgan put it the other day, he said, there's no tool that can so quickly rearrange your body parts as a chainsaw. Like you need to be careful with that. But if you're careful, if you've been trained carefully and if you have a mentor around, it's not especially risky. We always say it's more dangerous to get to campus in a car than it is to drop the tree, but it's scary. It's very scary, and I say that from personal experience. When you're getting ready to make that last back cut, and you're looking up, and then this thing is just thousands of pounds. Your adrenaline is through the roof, and then when it drops, one of the things we do is we put a little flag out. And the cool thing is using sort of more modern, sometimes people accuse us of being neo-Luddites, but we're using modern chainsaw techniques, not the old school ones in the 70s. Using those techniques, even a brand new neophyte, if you're dropping a fairly simple tree, obviously if it's got a good lean and all that stuff, but if you're dropping a fairly straightforward tree, you can get it within 4 or 5 feet of a flag target. Mm-hmm. So you've got a target. And then you drop it, and when when that tree hits the ground with that boom, and smashes the flag, nobody has to say, "Boy, you're sure an impressive young man." Of course you slap him on the back and you say, "Way to go," give him a high five. But he knows immediately. Everybody knows he just did something awesome, and he doesn't need to be sort of inflated. Like, what a nice drawing, Johnny. You don't need that.
Well, maybe this gets us back to maybe the differences between the way boys and girls are often educated. I think about Matthew Crawford. You mentioned him a minute ago in Shop Class of Soulcraft. He talks about in that book. I'll be with Matthew in a couple of weeks. He's going to be speaking at APL, and I'll be introducing him. But he notes that there's a kind of quiet confidence to a competent man. In other words, the competence comes first, and then the confidence follows. Yeah. And so you don't need, these this sort of great inflation, happy talk stuff. It's just like, okay, well, I know I can do stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, those boys, they went back to their high school on Monday or whatever, and they weren't the same kid. Yeah. And the other part is that because they had peers there who could recognize, Sam dropped a giant tree this weekend. There's a sort of communal. This is one of the big problems with rites of passage is that you have to have a community recognize that the boy is not the same as he was before.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a boarding school environment, among other things, is really helpful because everyone says you've been through the rite of passage, you've earned this sort of different treatment and behavior, and we all see it now.
Right. That's a good point. Now, when it comes to the challenges that we're facing more broadly in our culture, are you familiar with Rob Henderson and his book Troubled? Does that ring a bell? He's a guy who was raised in foster care in California. A very interesting book, but anyway, very, very troubled childhood. But the transformative experience for him, he was very bright and is very bright. He went on to get his PhD from, I think, Cambridge in the UK, and but in the process of sort of his moving out of this very troubled environment, drug use and so forth, it was the Air Force that was the kind of the rite of passage for him and provided him with the kind of structure that he just didn't have in that chaotic childhood that he had been in, and there was a very clear path that he could follow. That he could see, okay, if I do these things, I will, succeed. So I think, that is another sort of dimension to this. Because we live in a society where it's all about self-expression. As you noted earlier, you're supposed to kind of look in, and find that inner thing or whatever, and define yourself rather than just have, okay, these are the standards, meet them, and you'll have, the respect of your peers. We've lost that dimension of things, and sounds like you'll be able to have some things going on at the school that meet that, that need for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Now, when it comes to the academic side of it, it's maybe not the best way to put it, but in terms of what's going to be going on when you're at the desk, because you're not outside all the time. So what's the curriculum look like?
Yeah. So we are, we are a Hillsdale College curriculum school. So Hillsdale has their, their network of schools, and they have their member schools, but we are a curriculum school. So what that means is we're licensed to access their full sort of curriculum scope and sequence. And so that is essentially, we're going to depart from it in a number of different ways because of our own sort of purposes in our schooling, but it is the framework that we're modifying to fit our needs. And so in a lot of ways, they'll graduate with the same sort of course load as any kid at a typical classical Christian school. So it's not that different. We like to say that the mode of instruction, the mode of delivery is different, in that we want to do as much math and physics and geometry in the building arts as we can, and likewise we want to do as much science with our out in the garden and in animal husbandry as we can. So we want to integrate their learning as much as possible into the farm and into the building arts. But in general, the kind of curriculum will be your standard classical Christian curriculum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Well, the fact that you're able to kind of integrate the STEM subjects into like useful things that you're actually doing is great. I assume they'll be learning things like Latin and stuff.
So the plan right now, and this is a little bit of a departure from, so the Hillsdale curriculum has one language per year, and our plan right now is to have 2 languages per year. So classical Latin for 4 years. Freshman, sophomore year, a modern language, one modern language. We're going to have 48 students at our max, so we can't have 4 different choices, and that will depend on the instructor. There's a guy we'd love to have come teach French. He's a French lit professor, French theologian, or theology of French literature. And so if he comes, then we teach French, and if somebody else, then we'll teach German or Spanish. For the first 2 years, and then the last 2 years, we want to do biblical Greek. So, and part of we're as you mentioned earlier, we're an Anglican school. Yeah. So morning and evening prayer are built into that's the structure for our days. We will also, when the high school launches, we will functionally plant a church here on campus. So we're in the middle of rural Nelson County, which is a literal one stoplight county. We have 14,000 people here in the whole county. We're surrounded by modest-sized cities. So Charlottesville's just over the border there, and Waynesboro's just over the border there, and Lynchburg's just over the border there. But the county itself has no incorporated towns at all. That's small. So part of our vision, for me anyway, is a life oriented around the church, quite literally. So the chapel will be the last thing we build. It'll be right out this window in front of me, and so we will literally live our lives oriented around the chapel, with the chapel at the very heart of our campus.
That's great.
Yeah. But so I ramble a little bit, but part of it, one of their sort of rites of passage is going to be temporary licensure for my bishop to preach in the context of morning and evening prayer. And so part of what they'll be doing as juniors and seniors is preaching out of the lectionary in the context of the liturgy.
That's great. Yeah. So when it comes to the design of the campus, is there something on your website that lays it all out, what the dream is, kind of the finished product?
Maybe I'll, this was not planned, but I'm going to grab it anyway. This is our somewhat impressionistic watercolor that we had someone do of the Central Quad campus. There's the chapel.
Very nice.
As you can see there.
Great.
But yeah, there's the vision is that this Central Quad that's in front of me, behind, will have a great hall. So right now we're sitting in what's called the porter's house, which was inspired by the Benedictine rule. The porter's job was welcome and hospitality. And this is really our construction headquarters, but it's also a little bit of a welcoming place. Out here we have a dorm that we're building for our Joshua program that launches this fall. But then behind us we'll have the chapel eventually, but the next building is the Great Hall, which is a 7,000 square foot timber frame that will be our kind of all-purpose everything while we're building out the rest of campus. Eventually we'll have, Lord willing, a library, wood shop, forge, and the chapel, and then a faculty village over on that section of campus, and the primary farming operations will happen down by the historic farmhouse that's already there.
Yeah, kind of like a Oxford College laid out with the chapel right there and the hall and the quad.
Yeah, and part of the vision was I spent a few months. I actually grew up in Germany, as a kid, a little while, but I went back between college and grad school and worked for a couple months on a German farm. And just about every field that we worked in, you could hear the church bells.
Yeah.
And most of the fields, you could see the steeple sticking up above.
Nice.
And as I always say, it was both incredibly inspiring to me. It was also a nice warning, because when I went there on Sunday mornings, it was me and 6 other people. So putting the church geographically at the heart of a community doesn't make it the heart of the community.
Yeah.
It's not automatic. And yet there was something really beautiful and coherent about that vision.
Yeah. Well, it's so kind of the way it is in New England, too. You know, the heart of the town is the old white clapboard church. And, you know, sometimes it's a good place, sometimes it's not so good.
Right.
You know what I mean? Well, these are really great things to think about when it comes to how people can support what you're doing. I mean, you're the fundraiser. I hope there are ways that you've already got it set up so that people can onboard. Maybe there are some folks out there who listen to us. You know, we about 10 to 15,000 people will be listening to this episode, and maybe some of them will say, "That's exactly what I'm looking for." How can they onboard with you guys?
Yeah, so our website is stdunstansacademy.org. If you search St. Dunstan's Academy, we'll show up. There's the religion writer Tara Isabella Burton has a weird book. I haven't read it, but it's a weird book that mentions, I shouldn't even mention this, but it has St. Dunstan's Academy is at the center of it. So if you Google it, you'll find us usually first, and then somewhere there you find
the book. Okay,
the religion writer's book. But you'll find us if you Google us. And on that front page, you can scroll down. There's a link to donate and give. You can also stay connected. There's a newsletter we'll send out actually, maybe depending on when this airs, it'll either be our newest one will either be right before or right after this. But we send one out every 2 months. So not that often. We try not to clog people's inboxes. So you can stay connected that way. We also love to have people come out to campus. It's an incredibly beautiful spot. I should mention that it's this little rural county with 14,000 people also has more than 25 breweries, distilleries, wineries.
Oh, wow. That's Virginia.
Yeah. This is
you're talking to the right audience here.
Yeah, there's a highway that about a quarter mile that way. That it's not around here. It's actually got to go 5 minutes north to get there. But about 5 minutes north starts the Virginia's craft beverage trail.
Interesting. Wow. So what's the closest international airport to you? If, say, someone wanted to fly in.
Right. We're about midway between Lynchburg's airport and Charlottesville's international airport. So we're about an hour south of Charlottesville and about 45 minutes north of Lynchburg. So you can fly in there. You can fly into Richmond. It's about an hour and a half away. So we're as Natalie Fickley, our headmaster's wife, says, we're in the middle of everything, in the middle of nowhere. So we're not too far from anything. We're 40 minutes from a bunch of different little cities, but we're not too close to it.
No, it is lovely out there. I grew up in Richmond and Chesterfield, and so I used to make the trip out there, at least Charlottesville, quite regularly. Actually, close to kind of Ken Myers as well. He's out that way. Yep.
Yeah, Ken is on our advisory council actually.
Oh, great!
And he's the choir director at the church that I attend on Sundays as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, well,
and my wife works for Marsville Audio Journal as well, I should say. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, Ken's an old friend. Say hi to him. You were going to say something, Glenn?
Yeah, just a different question. Who is St. Dunstan?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so St. Dunstan is an English saint. He died in 988. So he's about 100 years after King Alfred and the Anglo-Saxon invasion. It's a kind of interesting story where the Anglo-Saxons invade and then they are essentially conquered by the Christians in their hearts. They're converted. But there's a lot of I taught history for 9 years, but I'm not a historian of the period by any means. But there's a lot of dispute about how deep the conversion was, and by the time St. Dunstan is emerging, there's a lot of corruption in the church. There's a lot of historians compare it to kind of the pre-Reformation medieval corruption in the Roman Catholic Church. So one of the ways to talk about Dunstan is that he is not in a sort of capital R Protestant reformer sense, but he is a reformer of the church. He's some people call him the first English reformer. Not in a, I mean, anyway, I don't
understand. Sure.
But what is he, how does he actually reform the church? Well, the interesting thing is, initially he's a monk and he's a bell maker. He's a metal worker. So he's first known as a tradesman, which is very interesting for us. And then he is essentially, one of these classic stories of being compelled to become the abbot of Gloucester Abbey
All the best guys were like they made them do it.
That's right. That's right. So then he founds a boys' school at Gloucester Abbey, reinvigorates the English schooling tradition. In a lot of ways, he starts the English boarding school tradition. There's kind of a revitalization of this around the Reformation and afterwards as well. But he starts a boys' school, and central to the boys' school is the boys' choir. And so the vision of a boys' school with a boys' choir is really founded by St. Dunstan himself. Eventually, then he is made Archbishop of Canterbury, has a very controversial tenure as Archbishop of Canterbury, fighting corruption both in the royalty and in the monasteries. So he's for us, he's a musician, he's a school founder, he's a tradesman, a craftsman. And in a broad sense, he's a sort of reformer of the church.
Sounds like our kind of guy.
Yeah,
it's a great story.
Yeah. I know I'd run into his name, but I didn't know anything about him.
Yeah, interestingly, he was up until Thomas à Becket gets himself martyred. He was the most for a century or so. He was the most popular English saint. But then, even though it's just one of these interesting vagaries of history that we in a sense capture him as a reformer, and he could have been remembered that way. But one of the things the abuses that he was fighting against was married clergy. And so the reformers were less interested in recapturing his legacy.
Sure.
So he gets kind of shunted a little bit to the side. But I do think, anyway, we could go down that path, but it's the sort of, in theory, not married, but actually married, was a real problem. Even if the solution was not, universally enforcing celibacy, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, there are some great examples of the in theory not married coming out of the period leading right into the Reformation. I talk about those all the time when I'm talking about why there was a need for reform at that point.
Yeah, super short story. There's a Norwegian bishop that I randomly ran across who dies in battle fighting against the Lutherans. He's not sainted. And I thought, well, that's strange. You got this Roman Catholic bishop who literally gets, killed by Lutherans in battle. It's strange that he's not sainted. And the reason was that he was known to have so many mistresses that he was a little bit. But the article, the essay that I was reading commented and said, contextually, this was at a time when celibacy was understood to mean that you did not marry the women with whom you cohabitated. So it was like universally assumed that you would actually have a mistress. You just wouldn't marry the mistress, and that's how you exercise priestly celibacy. It was just kind of like, okay, well, that seems like a problem.
There was some need. There was a need for reform at multiple levels. Then,
I've run into cases where you get these reform-minded bishops who really want to clean up their diocese. And, so they do a visitation. They send around people to inspect the congregations in the diocese. And, and this actually happens multiple times. You see this on the record in a lot of places. They'll go to the village, they'll discover that the priest has a mistress, has a concubine. And they'll talk to the villagers and they'll say, did you know that your priest is sleeping with Mary? And they said, what do you think we are, stupid? Of course we know that. Well, did you know that it's against canon law? I repeat the question, what do you think we are, stupid? Of course we know it's against canon law. Well, does it bother you that he's got this mistress? No, not particularly. Now, that got them really confused. Right. So they ask, well, why doesn't it bother you? And over, the answer you get is, well, if he's got her, he's more likely to keep his hands off our wives and daughters, isn't he? And you actually find this over and over in the visitation records. So, like I said, it was a real problem.
Yeah.
It also tells you a lot of what they thought of the clergy.
Right.
Maybe the opinions haven't changed too much, but anyway. But why don't we zero in again once more on the school? And we're getting close to the time that we need to get everything wrapped up by. So anything you want to leave us with, Mark, as we wrap up the show?
Nothing immediately comes to mind. I think, my sort of hobby horses are obviously the way that the sort of failed masculinity in modern American culture. But I think that's part of a broader divorce from embodiment. And so I think that when I look at all of the different sexual and identity crises confronting us and the kind of acedia and all these different things, to me, it seems like they're so deeply rooted in the continual disembodiment of American culture. And so, so one of our visions is how do you reorient people to creation, reorient people to their own bodies, to recognizing themselves as creatures of a good creator, and so much of I think modern craziness is unimaginable without that kind of divorce from your own creatureliness.
Yeah. I think you're onto it. I think you're onto something that needs to be broadly understood, because some of the, I guess, stuff that's going on in what they refer to as the manosphere, it just strikes me as kind of LARPing, as they say, live action role play, where, to be a man means these sort of thing, 3 or 4 things. And it doesn't have any sort of social context or utility. Yeah. It's just basically kind of like almost like you're a peacock or something, sort of just grooming yourself all the time. Yeah. Just weird stuff. Anyway, well, thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, it was great. And we will make sure that we have a link to the school in the show notes, and anything else you want us to include. That article that you wrote for Touchstone probably won't be out for another month or so we probably won't be able to have a link to that. Sure. But if there's anything else you want us to link, just let us know.
I'll do that. And the article that we didn't really get into just does talk a lot about that the way that the response in the manosphere is itself working within a feminist frame.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Celebrating masculinity is itself in a sort of weirdly self-referential thing that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. That's right. I'm a real man who doesn't really contribute anything to my community. Right. It's weird stuff. Anyway, but it's been a great conversation, and we thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. And speaking of being useful, you could be useful to us by becoming a patron of the show. We do have bills to pay, and we're grateful to all the folks who give to the show on a monthly basis. But if you'd like to join that regal band, you can do that by following a separate link in the show notes. We hope you check out Mark's school and all that's going on there, but we also hope you check out our Patreon page and decide to help us out. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.